The scent of aged linseed oil and turpentine clung to the air, a familiar perfume that was more comforting to Ilara Vance than any human embrace. At 22, her life was a study in quiet precision, much like the delicate work her hands performed. A single beam of dust-moted light slanted across her workbench, illuminating the fractured canvas before her. With a brush finer than a whisper, she applied a minuscule fleck of pigment to the cracked smile of a forgotten portrait, her breath held captive in her lungs. She wasn't just restoring a painting, she was mending a broken piece of history, giving voice to a beauty that time had tried to silence. In these moments, surrounded by the ghosts of art, Ilara felt a flicker of purpose, a stark contrast to the hollow echo that defined the rest of her existence. She was a restorer of things, yet her own soul remained in pieces. If you want to know what lies hidden beneath this perfect silent surface, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Her apprenticeship at the museum was a sanctuary, but the gilded cage awaited her return each evening. The Vance family home on the Upper East Side was not a place of warmth, but a mausoleum of forgotten grandeur, its opulent halls suffocating under the weight of impending financial ruin. Every polished marble floor and crystal chandelier seemed to mock their precarious position. Here, silence was not peaceful. It was a weapon, wielded with expert precision by her mother, a woman who valued appearances above all else. Ilara moved through the cavernous rooms like a phantom, her footsteps deliberately soft, her presence minimized. She had learned long ago that to be seen was to be judged, and to be judged was to be found wanting. Her life was a performance, and she was growing weary of the role she had been forced to play. This carefully constructed existence had left its mark on her, shaping her into a young woman of profound shyness and deep-seated repression. Her virginity was not a matter of romantic ideals or moral choice, but a fortress, the last unconquered territory of her own being. In a world where her future, her friendships, and even her thoughts were subject to familial transaction, her body remained the one thing that was unequivocally hers, untouched and unseen. This innocence was a shield, a fragile barrier against the expectations of a world that sought to mold her, package her, and sell her to the highest bidder. It was a silent rebellion, a secret she guarded as fiercely as the fragile canvases she spent her days healing, a testament to the person she might have been in another life. But her innocence was not her most fiercely guarded secret. That space in her soul was reserved for something she considered a fundamental flaw, a mark of shame branded onto her from birth. Sprawling across her left shoulder blade, hidden beneath layers of silk and propriety, was a birthmark, the color of a deep violet twilight. It was a unique, intricate map of skin that she had been taught to despise. Her mother's words, spoken throughout her childhood, were a constant, corrosive whisper in her mind. An imperfection, a flaw that rendered her unmarketable, a stain on the Vance family's pristine lineage. She had never allowed anyone to see it, the shame of it a physical weight she carried every single day, a constant reminder of her own supposed incompletion. The ultimate manifestation of her family's transactional ambition was her engagement. She was betrothed to a man of suitable pedigree, an emotionally sterile aristocrat whose interest in her was as calculated as a stock market investment. He was the solution to their financial woes, the key to preserving the Vance name from public disgrace. He had never seen her without her carefully constructed armor, had never asked about the dreams she harbored in the quiet of her studio, and he certainly had no idea about the violet secret she kept hidden. Marrying him would be the final act of erasure, a complete surrender of her identity to secure her family's legacy. The wedding, now being accelerated due to their dire circumstances, loomed not as a promise of love, but as the tolling of a final bell. Some evenings she would stand before the antique gilt-edged mirror in her bedroom, a stranger staring back at her. She saw the polished facade, the neatly pinned hair, the modest dress that betrayed no hint of her true form, the placid expression which she had perfected over years of practice. But her own eyes saw through the illusion. They saw the flicker of a caged spirit, the profound loneliness that ached in her chest. Her hand would instinctively drift to her left shoulder, her fingers tracing the outline of her dress over the hidden mark. The fabric was a lie she wore as a second skin. The girl in the mirror was a beautiful hollow doll, and the real Ilara, the one with the violet-stained skin and the fractured soul, was screaming from the inside. Looking out from her window, the city of New York pulsed with a vibrant, chaotic energy that felt a world away from the stagnant air of her home. Taxis streaked by like yellow comets, and the distant murmur of millions of lives being lived filled the night. Down there, people were free. They made their own choices, loved whomever they desired, and showed their true selves to the world without fear. They were not bound by decaying legacies or the desperate need to maintain appearances. A profound yearning would wash over her, a desperate desire to shed her skin, to run into that anonymous crowd and simply be. But the window was thick, the glass cold against her forehead, a transparent barrier as insurmountable as the one built around her heart. She was a spectator to life, not a participant. Dinner at the Vance residence was a ritual of silent warfare, conducted across a vast expanse of polished mahogany that reflected the cold, distant light of the crystal chandelier above. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound punctuating the oppressive quiet, each noise a carefully measured beat in a funereal rhythm. Ilara sat perfectly straight, her spine a rigid column of learned obedience, her gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of her plate. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Her mother, Beatrice, presided over the table from the opposite end, her presence as commanding as a general's. Tonight, the unspoken subject hanging in the air was the accelerated timeline for Ilara's wedding, a topic treated not with joy, but with the grim finality of a business merger being pushed through to avert a hostile takeover. Every silent chew, every demure sip of water was an act of compliance. Beatrice Vance was a masterpiece of controlled preservation, her face a smooth, unlined mask that betrayed no hint of the desperation churning beneath the surface. She spoke of duty as if it were a sacred text, her voice a low, melodic hum that coiled around Ilara like a silken rope. Her pronouncements on the importance of lineage, of maintaining their social standing, were delivered with the casual authority of someone who had never known doubt. She would often reach across the table to adjust a stray strand of Ilara's hair, or smooth a non-existent crease in her sleeve, her touch light but proprietary, a constant physical reminder of who was in control. Her love was a conditional currency, doled out in exchange for perfect adherence to the blueprint she had designed for Ilara's life, a life that was merely an extension of her own ambitions. Her father, a man who once commanded boardrooms with a booming voice, was now a specter at his own table. Defeated by a series of catastrophic financial decisions, he had receded into the background of their lives, his presence marked only by the faint scent of aged scotch and the weary slump of his shoulders. He rarely spoke during these family rituals, his eyes vacant as they stared at the rich tapestries lining the walls, perhaps seeing in their fading threads a reflection of his own diminished fortunes. His silence was not a comfort to Ilara, but an affirmation of her own powerlessness. He was a co-conspirator in her gilded imprisonment, his inaction a form of consent. In his abdication of authority, he had left her utterly defenseless against the crushing weight of her mother's will, a silent partner in the sale of his own daughter. The journey from the suffocating stillness of her home to the hushed reverence of the museum was the only time Ilara felt a semblance of freedom. Descending into the subway system was like entering another world, a chaotic, vibrant ecosystem teeming with lives utterly different from her own. Here, surrounded by the anonymous press of the crowd, she could almost disappear. She studied the faces around her, the weary construction worker, the laughing students, the woman reading a dog-eared paperback, and felt a pang of profound envy. They were unburdened by the weight of a name, their futures unwritten, their choices their own. For those 20 minutes, packed into a rattling metal car hurtling through the darkness beneath the city, she wasn't Ilara Vance, the designated savior of a fallen dynasty. She was just a girl, invisible and blessedly ordinary. Arthur, her fiancé, was a man assembled from a catalog of appropriate attributes: old money, a respectable family name, and an emotional range as narrow and predictable as the pinstripes on his bespoke suits. His visits were formal, scheduled events. He would present her with gifts, a diamond tennis bracelet, a first-edition book by an author she'd never mentioned, that felt less like tokens of affection and more like down payments. He spoke of their future as one would a corporate strategy, detailing the social events they would attend and the alliances their union would fortify. He never asked about her work, her passions, or the source of the deep-seated sadness he had to have noticed in her eyes. To him, she was an asset, the most beautiful and well-behaved acquisition of his life, and he treated her with the detached care one might afford a priceless but inanimate object. The wedding preparations were an assault on her senses, a relentless campaign to transform her into the perfect bride. During a fitting for her gown, she stood on a pedestal, a silent mannequin draped in yards of suffocating white silk. The seamstress buzzed around her, her chatter about French lace and pearl buttons a meaningless drone in the background. Her mother stood nearby, her eyes narrowed in critical assessment, issuing quiet, cutting directives. Cinch the waist further, she needs to look more delicate. Each pinprick from the seamstress's needle felt like a puncture in her very soul, stitching her into a destiny she hadn't chosen. She stared at her reflection in the three-way mirror, seeing a pale, hollow-eyed stranger being packaged for delivery, her true self buried deeper and deeper under layers of pristine, suffocating fabric. One evening, the carefully maintained silence of the house was broken by the sound of her parents' voices, a low, urgent murmur seeping from behind the closed doors of her father's study. Ilara paused in the hallway, her heart pounding. She couldn't make out every word, but the fragments she caught were sharp and clear. No other choice. The creditors are closing in. Ilara's marriage is the only thing keeping us from ruin. The words confirmed her deepest fears, transforming the abstract pressure into a tangible, crushing weight. She was not just a pawn in a social game. She was a human sacrifice, her future the price to be paid for her father's failures and her mother's pride. The realization settled in her stomach like a stone, cold and heavy. Her marriage wasn't just expected, it was essential. There was no escape. The prison of her life extended far beyond the walls of her home. It was reinforced at every charity gala, every sterile cocktail party, every gathering of New York's high society. She remembered the suffocating scrutiny of her debutante ball, a night she was presented to the world like a prized filly at auction. The matriarchs of the city's other dynasties had circled her, their eyes like scalpels, dissecting her posture, her smile, her conversation. Their polite inquiries felt like interrogations, assessing her value, her pedigree, her suitability for breeding. She learned to smile placidly, to offer demure, non-committal answers, to become a perfect mirror reflecting their own values back at them. In this world, a woman's worth was measured by her silence, her obedience, and the strategic value of her marriage. Individuality was a liability, a dangerous flaw to be stamped out. Alone in the velvet dimness of her bedroom, the engagement ring on her finger felt like a manacle. It was a flawless emerald-cut diamond, cold and impossibly heavy, a constant physical reminder of her bondage. She would often twist it, trying to slide it over her knuckle, but it always felt stuck, a permanent fixture. Her reflection in the antique mirror showed a young woman she barely recognized, her features arranged into a mask of serene compliance. But her eyes told the truth. They were windows to a soul in turmoil, screaming for release. She would instinctively wrap her arms around herself, her right hand covering her left shoulder, a protective gesture over the secret she guarded so fiercely. The girl in the mirror was a beautifully crafted lie, and the thought of Arthur one day discovering the truth of her body and the truth of her spirit filled her with a dread as deep as the ocean. An invitation lay on her vanity, its thick cream-colored cardstock embossed with the museum's official seal. It was for the annual Benefactors Gala, the most important social event of the season, and, her mother had informed her, a critical opportunity to present a united front with Arthur's family. For Ilara, the elegant calligraphy spelled out not a night of celebration, but another long evening of performance. She would have to wear the smile, make the small talk, and stand beside the man she was contracted to marry, all while her spirit withered inside. She picked up the card, its sharp edges digging into her palm. It felt less like an invitation and more like a final summons before her sentence. A profound sense of hopelessness washed over her. This gala, this performance, was just another step on the inexorable path to a life that would be a beautiful, hollow, and unbearable cage. The air in the museum's grand hall, usually a comforting blend of history and preservation, was thick with the cloying sense of expensive perfume and quiet desperation. Tonight, it was a marketplace, and the art was merely a backdrop for the real transactions taking place. From across the sea of champagne flutes and forced smiles, a figure stood apart, a predator in a room full of gilded sheep. Damien Blackwood. His name was a whisper on the lips of the city's elite, a word spoken with a mixture of fear and avarice. He was a specter from a different world, a man who had built an empire from the rubble of others, earning the moniker the Vulture. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the light around him, he moved with a dangerous stillness, his presence a stark, magnetic void in the glittering, chattering crowd. Ilara felt his presence before she truly saw him, a sudden drop in the room's temperature, a prickling on her skin as if a storm were gathering on the horizon. Her mother, ever the strategist, leaned in, her voice a low murmur against Ilara's ear. "That is Damien Blackwood. He is essential." The word hung in the air, stripped of all humanity. He wasn't a man, he was a solution, a potential investor, the final piece in the puzzle of their salvation. Ilara's gaze followed her mother's, and her breath caught. He was nothing like the polished, pedigreed men who populated her world. There was a raw, untamed quality to him, an intensity in his dark eyes that seemed to strip away the finery and pretense, leaving only the stark, uncomfortable truth. He was a threat, and yet a part of her she didn't understand felt an inexplicable, terrifying pull.
Damien Blackwood despised these gatherings. He saw them for what they were, elaborate rituals of self-congratulation performed by people who had never known a day of genuine struggle. His eyes, honed by years of navigating corporate battlefields and the brutal realities of his own past, swept across the room with a cold, analytical disdain. He saw the desperate smiles of men whose fortunes were crumbling, the predatory glances of women assessing their next marital acquisition, the hollow laughter of heirs coasting on the achievements of their ancestors. It was a world of surfaces, of beautiful, rotting facades, and he had come here tonight with the singular purpose of finding the cracks, the weaknesses he could exploit. He was not here to mingle. He was here to hunt, to dismantle the very empires that had once deemed people like him invisible, unworthy. Then his gaze stopped. It settled on a young woman standing near a 17th century Dutch landscape, a figure of such quiet stillness she was almost invisible against the room's loud opulence. Ilara Vance. He knew who she was, the designated sacrifice for her family's impending collapse. But where others saw a demure, perfectly packaged bride-to-be, Damien saw something else entirely. He saw the rigid control in her posture, a body braced against an unseen impact. He saw the flicker of a caged soul in her eyes as she stared at the painting, a profound loneliness that resonated with the desolate landscapes of his own heart. She was a ghost at her own feast, a prisoner in a silk gown. And for the first time that evening, he felt a sliver of genuine, dangerous interest. She was a puzzle he suddenly wanted to solve. He moved with a fluid, deliberate grace that belied his formidable reputation, cutting a path through the crowd that parted for him as if by instinct. Ilara was so lost in the restored brushstrokes of the painting, a piece she herself had spent weeks painstakingly mending, that she didn't notice his approach until he was standing beside her. His proximity was a physical shock, a sudden wave of heat and the faint, clean scent of bergamot and something wilder, like cold night air. He didn't offer a polite greeting or a meaningless social pleasantry. He simply stood there, his shadow falling over her, his silence more commanding than any words. Her fiancé, Arthur, was momentarily trapped in a conversation with a portly banker, leaving her utterly exposed. Her heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs, a trapped bird beating its wings. "A beautiful lie," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floor and up into her very bones. His gaze was not on her, but on the canvas. All this effort to preserve something that was meant to decay. You patch the cracks, you brighten the colors, but you can't erase the truth of its age. It's a cynical act of commerce, dressing up a corpse to inflate its value for the next buyer. His words were a direct assault, not just on the painting, but on her work, on the very core of what gave her life a sliver of meaning. He was testing her, peeling back the layers of her polite facade with brutal, unvarnished honesty. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to murmur a polite agreement and escape. But something else, something fierce and long dormant, rose up in her throat. She turned to face him, her eyes for the first time meeting his directly. "You're wrong," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the ambient noise with a surprising clarity. "It's not about commerce. It's not a lie. It's about rescuing a soul. The artist poured his life into this canvas, and time tried to silence him. To restore it is to let him speak again. It's about honoring the beauty that survives, not hiding the damage." The words came from a deep, hidden wellspring of passion she rarely allowed herself to access. She was defending not just the painting, but herself, the broken parts of her own soul that she spent her days trying to mend in secret. The defiance felt like a gasp of fresh air after a lifetime of suffocation. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Damien's dark eyes. It wasn't anger or dismissal. It was a flash of genuine surprise, perhaps even a sliver of respect. He had expected a timid, rehearsed response, the vapid pleasantries of her class. He had not expected this quiet fire, this fierce, articulate defense of beauty from a woman he had assumed was merely a decorative object. Her words had struck a chord, resonating with a part of him that understood the struggle to survive, the will to endure despite the damage. He saw her then, not as Alara Vance, the socialite, but as the restorer, the healer of fractured things. The tension between them shifted, the sharp edge of his antagonism softening into the far more dangerous blade of genuine interest. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, a silent, involuntary acknowledgement of the woman he had just discovered. Just as the charged silence between them stretched to its breaking point, Arthur reappeared, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred. "Darling," he said, his hand landing on Alara's arm with a casual, proprietary air. "Mr. Blackwood, an honor." He offered a hand to Damien, his smile a mask of practiced cordiality that failed to hide the wary respect one afforded a known shark.
Damien's attention shifted, his expression once again becoming an impenetrable mask of cool indifference. He shook Arthur's hand, but his eyes lingered on Alara for a moment longer, a silent, private message passing between them. An acknowledgement of the truth she had spoken, a promise of something yet to come. The connection was as invisible and as undeniable as a magnetic field, a secret shared in plain sight. Arthur steered her away, his chatter about market trends and mutual acquaintances fading into a meaningless drone in Alara's ears. Her arm tingled where Arthur held it, but her entire being was still electrified by Damien's presence. The brief, intense encounter had left her feeling stripped bare, exposed in a way she had never been before. He hadn't looked at her with the bland appraisal of Arthur, or the critical assessment of her mother. He had looked into her, his gaze cutting through the layers of duty and fear to see the person she kept hidden from the world. The feeling was terrifying, a violation of the fortress she had so carefully constructed around her heart. But it was also undeniably exhilarating. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, truly seen. And that dangerous, intoxicating realization had planted a seed of rebellion in the carefully tended, barren garden of her soul. The days that followed the gala were a study in dissonance. Ilara's world was ostensibly unchanged. She returned to the quiet solitude of her studio, the scent of turpentine a familiar balm, and endured the sterile dinners and wedding planning sessions with Arthur. Yet everything felt different. A ghost now walked with her, a tall, dark-suited specter with eyes that saw too much. Damien Blackwood's presence lingered in her mind like the stain of a potent pigment, coloring every thought, every interaction. She would catch herself replaying their brief conversation, the low timbre of his voice, the shocking, brutal honesty of his words. He had unsettled the placid surface of her existence, and now dangerous currents were swirling in the depths, threatening to pull her under into a world of feelings she had long taught herself to fear. He found her a week later, not in the glittering performance of a social event, but in her sanctuary. He appeared at the entrance of her restoration studio as if summoned by her own unbidden thoughts, his presence sucking the very air from the room. He claimed to be inspecting the museum's conservation efforts, a potential benefactor making his rounds, but his eyes were only for her. He walked around her workspace, his gaze sweeping over the tools of her trade, the jars of pigment, the half-mended canvases. He stopped before a delicate Italian fresco fragment she was working on. "Another rescue?" he asked, his voice laced with that same cynical amusement. "Are you not merely delaying the inevitable? Everything beautiful is destined to break." His challenge was a gauntlet thrown down, a deliberate prodding at the very core of her purpose. This time she was ready for him. She did not flinch or look away. Setting down her finest brush, she met his gaze, a spark of defiance kindling in her chest. "Perhaps," she answered, her voice steady, "or perhaps the most profound beauty is found not in perfection, but in what has endured the breaking. This piece has survived centuries, earthquakes, wars. It has earned its scars. My job is not to erase its history, but to make sure its voice isn't lost. It's a testament to survival." She ran a gentle finger along a hairline crack in the plaster, her touch a caress. "Some things are worth fighting for, Mr. Blackwood. Not everything is a commodity to be bought or discarded when it shows its age." She was no longer just defending the art, she was defending herself, and he knew it. Their paths crossed again in the museum's archives, a place even more private and sacred than her studio. It was a labyrinth of rolling shelves, steeped in the dry, sweet scent of aging paper and leather-bound history. They were both there under the pretense of researching the provenance of a new acquisition, a task that forced them into close proximity in the narrow aisle. The air grew thick, charged with an unspoken awareness of their bodies moving so close to one another. He reached for a heavy, dust-covered ledger on a high shelf at the exact moment she did, his hand inadvertently closing over hers. The contact was electric, a sudden searing heat that shot up her arm and seemed to stop her heart in his chest. The rough texture of his skin against the back of her hand was a shocking, intimate reality. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. The world contracted to that single point of contact, the warmth of his hand a brand against her skin. She could feel the faint, steady pulse in his wrist, a powerful, rhythmic beat that seemed to echo the frantic hammering in her own chest. She slowly lifted her eyes to his, and what she saw there stole her breath. The cool, calculating mask had slipped, and for a fraction of a second she saw something raw and unguarded, a flicker of intense, possessive hunger that was as terrifying as it was compelling. It was a look that bypassed all social convention, a primal acknowledgement of the invisible current that flowed between them. He had felt it too. The realization was a dizzying, dangerous thing, a secret that now belonged to them both.
She released her hand as if he'd been burned, his composure snapping back into place with practiced ease. But the damage was done. A line had been crossed. He stepped back, putting a careful foot of distance between them, his expression once again unreadable. "My apologies," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that did nothing to soothe her frayed nerves. Ilara could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She retreated to the far end of the aisle, her back turned to him, her hand pressed against her chest as if to calm her racing heart. The touch had been an accident, a fleeting, meaningless event. But she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that it was a lie. Nothing about this man was accidental. He was a force of nature, and she had just been caught in the heart of the storm. The annual hospital charity auction was the kind of event Ilara normally endured with quiet resignation. Seated at a table with Arthur and his parents, she was the perfect image of the demure fiancé, a beautiful, silent accessory. A lot came up for bid that made her heart ache with longing. A rare first edition collection of treatises on Renaissance restoration techniques, its leather binding worn with age. She knew Arthur would never understand its value to her, but she watched the bidding with a desperate hope. He made a respectable, almost lazy bid, more as a gesture of public largesse than out of any desire to please her. He was immediately outbid. Then, from a table in the shadows at the back of the grand ballroom, a new voice entered the fray, calm, decisive, and utterly commanding. Damien Blackwood.
What followed was not a bidding war. It was a public execution. Every time Arthur's father, goaded by his son's wounded pride, raised their paddle, Damien countered instantly, doubling the amount without a flicker of emotion. The room fell silent, all eyes on the quiet, brutal display of power. Arthur's face was a mask of polite fury, his knuckles white where he gripped his champagne flute. It was no longer about the books. It was a primal contest for dominance, and Damien was making it painfully clear who held all the power. He won the lot for a sum that was utterly obscene, an amount that could have single-handedly erased a significant portion of her family's debt. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed the shattering of Arthur's public facade, and Ilara felt a wave of dizzying, conflicting emotions. She should have felt humiliated for Arthur, ashamed by the raw, predatory display. A part of her was, but another, darker part of her, a part she had never known existed, felt a terrifying, electrifying thrill. Damien hadn't even looked at her, yet every person in that room knew the books were not for him. The gesture was a message, a public branding. He was demonstrating in the most audacious way possible that he could take whatever and whoever he wanted. He was showing her the scope of his power, a world away from the crumbling, genteel impotence of men like her father and Arthur. He was a king, and they were merely courtiers. In that moment, sitting beside her defeated fiancé, Ilara felt less like a victim of the humiliation and more like the spoils of a war she hadn't even known was being fought over her. The collection of books arrived at her family's townhouse the following afternoon, delivered by a silent courier. The package was large, wrapped in simple brown paper with no return address, though none was needed. She took it to her room, her hands trembling as she carefully unwrapped it, the scent of old leather and history filling the air. The books were even more beautiful up close, their pages filled with the wisdom and passion of masters long dead. They felt like a key, a secret passed directly to her. Tucked inside the cover of the first volume was a small, thick card. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she picked it up. There was no greeting, no signature, just 5 words written in a bold, slashing script that was unmistakably his. Beauty that survives is powerful. The words were a direct echo of her own, spoken in the quiet of her studio. He had listened, he had remembered. He hadn't just heard her, he had understood the philosophy that she poured into his work, the belief that gave her quiet life meaning. This was not a gift of charity or a simple token of interest. It was an act of profound, intimate recognition. He was acknowledging the strength he saw in her, the resilience she herself rarely dared to see. The gesture was more seductive than any jewel, more intoxicating than any whispered compliment. It bypassed all her defenses and struck at the very core of her being. He saw her, the real her, the woman who found salvation in mending broken things, and he had just told her that he did not see her as flawed, but as powerful. Holding the book to her chest, the weight of her engagement ring on her other hand suddenly felt unbearable, a cold, foreign object. The life it represented, a safe, gilded prison of duty and emotional sterility with Arthur, seemed to pale and shrink in the face of the raw, vital connection she felt with Damien. A profound and terrifying schism opened within her. To continue on her current path was to honor her family, to fulfill her duty, to secure a future of predictable comfort. It was the right thing to do, the only thing she had ever been raised to do.
But to even consider the world Damien represented, a world of dangerous passion, of brutal honesty, of being truly seen, felt like the ultimate betrayal. It was a choice between her soul and her family, between a life of quiet desperation and a leap into a terrifying, unknown abyss.
She began to see him everywhere, or perhaps she was simply looking for him now. A glimpse of his tailored suit disappearing into a building across the street, the sight of his sleek black car idling at a corner, a fleeting moment of eye contact at a crowded gallery opening. Each instance was a small, sharp shock to her system, a reminder of the secret current that now ran beneath the surface of her life. He never approached her in these moments, never spoke. He simply let her see him, his presence a constant, silent question hanging in the air. The tension was becoming a physical thing, a tight coil in her stomach that never fully unwound. She was living a double life, her outward existence one of serene compliance, her inner world a maelstrom of fear, guilt, and a desire so potent it frightened her. She tried to fight it. She focused on the final details of her wedding gown, the seating charts for the reception, the polite, empty conversations with Arthur. She attempted to conjure feelings of affection for him, to remember the safety and security he represented. But it was like trying to start a fire with damp wood. His touch left her cold. His kisses were a dry, papery obligation. All she could feel was the memory of Damien's hand over hers, the phantom heat that still lingered on her skin. She was becoming a stranger to herself, this woman who harbored secret, treacherous thoughts, who longed for the presence of a man who was, by all accounts, her family's enemy. The moral compass that had guided her entire life was spinning wildly, its needle no longer pointing toward the familiar shores of duty and honor. Damien, too, was caught in a battle of his own making. Ilara Vance was supposed to be a pawn, a vulnerability in the Vance dynasty that he could exploit for his own ends. He had approached her with the cold calculation of a predator isolating its prey. But her quiet strength, her fierce defense of broken beauty, her unvarnished soul, these were things he had not anticipated. She was an anomaly in his world of greed and deception. Her innocence was not a weakness, but a kind of purity that acted as a mirror, reflecting his own jaded, scarred interior. He found himself drawn to her against all logic, against every instinct for self-preservation he had honed over a lifetime of hardship. This girl, this restorer of forgotten things, was threatening to uncover the one thing he kept buried deeper than any secret, his own fractured heart. One rain-lashed evening, as she was leaving the museum, pulling the collar of her coat tight against the biting wind, his car materialized from the downpour, gliding to a silent stop directly in her path. The tinted rear window slid down, revealing him in the dim interior light. His expression was intense, almost grim, as if he were acting against his own better judgment. "Get in the car, Ilara," he said. It was not a request. It was a command, a recognition that the game of stolen glances and cryptic messages was over. The city lights blurred behind him, the rain streaming down the glass like tears. The moment felt both inevitable and impossible, the culmination of weeks of escalating tension. She stood frozen on the pavement, the cold rain plastering strands of hair to her face, her heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm. Getting into that car would be an irrevocable step, a transgression from which there would be no return. It would be a conscious choice to turn her back on her duty, her family, her entire life. But to walk away, to retreat back into the safety of her gilded cage, suddenly felt like a different kind of death, a slow suffocation of the soul. The interior of the car looked like a dark, intimate sanctuary from the storm. He waited, his gaze unwavering, leaving the choice entirely, terrifyingly, up to her. In that moment, the conflict was no longer an abstract dilemma. It was a man in a car on a rainy night, offering her a future she desperately wanted and profoundly feared. With a final, desperate act of will, she broke from Arthur's grasp, murmuring a panicked, incoherent excuse about needing air. Her movement was a blur of silk and desperation, a frantic escape from the suffocating ballroom. She fled down a deserted corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to judge her transgression. Each step was a rebellion, a severing of the invisible threads of duty that had bound her since birth. She found a small, unused antechamber, its air still and cool, and slipped inside, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her with a sound of profound finality. Leaning against the cold wood, she ripped the suffocating mask from her face, gasping for breath as if she had been underwater her entire life and had only just broken the surface. The silence was a balm, a temporary reprieve from the life she could no longer bear to live. The click of the lock turning was so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. The door swung inward, and Damian Blackwood filled the frame, a figure of shadow and intent against the distant light of the hallway.
He closed the door behind him, sealing them together in the dim, intimate space. He had removed his own mask, and without it, the raw intensity of his face was startling, his eyes burning with a dark, focused light that pinned her in place. He didn't speak, simply watched her, his stillness more unnerving than any accusation. The small room suddenly felt charged, the air crackling with the unspoken tension that had been building between them for weeks. He took a slow, deliberate step towards her, and every instinct she possessed screamed at her to both run and stay, a paralyzing conflict that left her rooted to the spot. "Running from your cage, little bird?" he finally asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the silence. "Or are you finally learning to fly?" The question was not a mockery. It was a genuine inquiry, a challenge that cut straight to the heart of her turmoil. The truth of it, the raw accuracy of his perception, was too much to bear. A sob of frustration and fear caught in her throat. She spun away from him, a sharp, defensive gesture meant to shield herself from his all-seeing gaze. In her panicked movement, the delicate silk strap of her gown, already strained, gave way. The fabric slid down her arm, a whisper of sound in the quiet room, exposing the entire expanse of her left shoulder and back to the cool air and his consuming eyes. The sudden cold on her skin was nothing compared to the freezing wave of pure, undiluted shame that washed over her. It was her deepest horror realized, her most guarded secret laid bare under the gaze of the one man whose opinion had inexplicably come to matter more than any other. The sprawling violet-hued birthmark felt like a brand, a grotesque map of her own imperfection, now visible for him to see, to judge, to be repulsed by. She instinctively tried to pull the ruined gown back into place, her fingers fumbling with the slick fabric. "Don't," she whispered, her voice choked with a lifetime of conditioned self-loathing, her back still turned to him. "Please, you can't see this." It was a desperate plea, the last prayer of a soul that believed itself to be fundamentally, irrevocably flawed. She waited for the inevitable recoil, the quiet sound of his retreat, the soft word of pity that would be more cutting than any insult. But the sound that came was the soft rustle of expensive wool, the faint creak of leather as he moved. He did not retreat. He advanced. Then, in an act so profound and unexpected, it shattered her entire reality. Damian Blackwood knelt. He went down on one knee behind her, not like a suitor, but like a supplicant before a sacred relic. The gesture was one of utter reverence, a complete inversion of the power dynamic that governed their world. From this humbled position, his gaze was level with the mark on her skin. The world seemed to stop spinning, the air growing thick and heavy as Ilara stood frozen, unable to comprehend the silent, breathtaking act of worship happening behind her. Then came his touch. It was not the clinical appraisal of a doctor, or the hesitant touch of a lover unsure of what he would find. His fingers, warm and firm, traced the intricate edges of the birthmark with a slow, deliberate reverence. The contact was electric, a trail of fire that did not burn with shame, but cauterized the old wound, erasing decades of her mother's corrosive whispers in a single, searing caress. He was not recoiling from her flaw. He was exploring it, learning its geography, as if it were the most beautiful landscape he had ever discovered. He leaned closer, his breath a warm whisper against her skin, and his voice when he spoke was a low, possessive rumble that vibrated through her very bones, rewriting her soul. "This," he said, his words a sacred vow, "is exactly how I want it." The words broke her, not in the way she had always feared being broken, but in the way a dam breaks, unleashing a flood of emotion she had held back for a lifetime. The shame, the fear, the loneliness, it was all washed away by the raw, stunning power of his acceptance. More than acceptance, it was desire. He wanted the part of her she had been taught to despise, the secret stain she believed made her unworthy of love. A ragged sob escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated release. Slowly she turned to face him, the ruined gown forgotten. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time they were not tears of sorrow. She looked down at this powerful, dangerous man kneeling before her, and she saw not a vulture, but a savior. He rose to his feet, his eyes never leaving hers, and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. In his dark eyes she saw a reflection of her own soul-deep loneliness, a flicker of a shared wound that he had recognized in her from the very beginning. And then she surrendered. She surged forward, her mouth finding his in a kiss that was not gentle or tentative, but a desperate, hungry collision of two starving souls. It tasted of rain and whiskey and a profound, aching longing. His hands slid from her face, one tangling in her hair, the other settling possessively on the small of her back, pulling her flush against the hard lines of his body, claiming her completely.
When the kiss finally broke, they remained pressed together, foreheads touching, their breaths mingling in the charged air. The world outside the small room, the party, Arthur, her family, her duty, had ceased to exist. There was only the solid, grounding reality of him, the steady beat of his heart against hers. He pulled back just enough to look at her, and the cool, calculating armor he wore for the world was gone. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored her own. She saw the shadows of his own past in his eyes, the scars of a man who understood what it meant to be broken, to be judged, to survive. He saw her, all of her, from the mended canvases to the violet-stained skin, and in his gaze she was not flawed. She was a masterpiece. "I have spent my life taking things apart," he murmured, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Breaking empires, dismantling fortunes, destroying things." His thumb stroked the curve of her cheekbone, his touch now infinitely gentle. "I never knew," he confessed, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that stole her breath, "what it felt like to want to put something beautiful back together." In that moment, he was no longer just the man who desired her secret flaw. He was the man who revealed his own. He was as fractured as any canvas she had ever mended, and in the ruins of her old life, surrounded by the wreckage of her broken duty, she knew with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty that she was the only one in the world who could ever hope to restore him.
The delicate spell woven in the antechamber shattered with the distant, muffled sound of a champagne cork popping, a cheerful explosion that seemed to mock the seismic intimacy of their kiss. Reality, cold and sharp, crashed down upon them. Damien's body tensed, the fluid lines of his embrace hardening back into rigid control. He pulled away from her, and the transition was a brutal physical shock. The hands that had held her with such reverence now felt distant, his touch turning from a caress to a steadying, almost impersonal gesture. His face, which moments before had been an open book of raw vulnerability, was shuddering, the cool, impenetrable mask of Damien Blackwood sliding back into place. He looked at her, his eyes now holding a flicker of something she couldn't name, regret, or perhaps self-loathing, and the warmth between them evaporated, leaving a chilling, desolate void in its place. Her return to the ballroom was a walk through a waking nightmare, each step an agony of self-consciousness. She felt as though their kiss, his touch, had left a visible brand on her skin. The world seemed too loud, the lights too bright. Her mother found her near the French doors, her eyes like a hawk's, missing nothing, the slight disarray of Ilara's hair, the faint tremor in her hands, the ruined strap of her gown she clutched in a fist. Beatrice's expression was a masterpiece of controlled fury. Before she could speak, Arthur was there, his face pale, his smile a tight, bloodless slash across his face. He had seen her flee, had seen Damien follow. He said nothing, but the silent, possessive fury in his gaze was a verdict. In that single loaded glance, the carefully constructed artifice of their future together crumbled into dust. The silence between them more damning than any accusation. The journey home was a descent into a frigid, suffocating hell. Beatrice sat in the back of the town car like a marble statue, her disapproval radiating a palpable cold that filled the small space. Her father stared out the window, his reflection a ghostly image of defeat. Once the heavy front door of their home closed behind them, the silence finally broke. Beatrice's voice was not raised, it was low, precise, and laced with a venom that flayed Ilara's soul. She accused Ilara of a selfish, wanton act of destruction, of taking their last hope for salvation and setting it on fire for a moment of foolish passion. She called her a disgrace, a flawed product who had finally revealed her worthlessness. Every word was a carefully chosen stone meant to build a new prison of shame around Ilara, to bury the memory of Damien's acceptance under an avalanche of guilt. Alone in the velvet prison of her bedroom, Ilara felt the walls closing in. The echo of her mother's words twisted the memory of the antechamber, tainting it with shame. Had Damien's reverence been a lie, a calculated, cruel seduction designed to be the final killing blow in his war against families like hers? Doubt, a corrosive acid, began to eat away at the beautiful, fragile certainty she had felt in his arms. She stumbled to the mirror, her trembling hands pulling aside the fabric of her ruined gown to reveal the birthmark. She stared at the sprawling violet map on her skin, but she no longer saw it through her own eyes. She saw it through her mother's, a mark of her ruin. Then she tried to see it through his, a landscape of breathtaking beauty. The two opposing visions warred within her, tearing her apart, leaving her adrift in a sea of terrifying uncertainty and profound, soul-crushing guilt. Meanwhile, in a stark penthouse that felt more like a fortress than a home, Damien Blackwood stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, the glittering city lights spread below him like a conquered kingdom. The victory of the evening, the public humiliation of his rivals, felt like ashes in his mouth. He had gone to that antechamber with the cold intent of a predator cornering its prey, intending to secure his final piece of leverage over the Vance family.
But he had not accounted for her. He had not accounted for the raw courage in her tears, the shocking, unvarnished truth of her skin, the way her surrender felt less like a conquest and more like a homecoming. For the first time in his life, his armor had been breached. The feeling of wanting to protect, to mend, to cherish something was a foreign, terrifying sensation, a vulnerability he could not afford. He had retreated out of instinct, severing the connection before it could sever him. The official fallout was swift and merciless. The next morning, a single curt phone call from Arthur's father to hers formally terminated the engagement. The news was delivered to Alara not with sympathy, but with the cold finality of a judge passing sentence. "You have squandered everything," Beatrice told her, her voice devoid of all emotion. "You are no longer a daughter of this house. You are simply a resident, a reminder of the disgrace you brought upon us." The home she had always known transformed overnight. She was ostracized, her presence ignored, her meals left on a tray outside her bedroom door as if she were a contagion. The suffocating oppression of her old life was replaced by a new, more profound agony. The utter desolation of being invisible, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own family. The silence from Damien was the cruelest blow of all. A day passed, then two, then a week. The void of his presence grew into a deafening roar in her mind. There were no more cryptic gifts, no more intense fleeting glances across a room. It was as if the man who had knelt before her, who had shattered her world and rebuilt it with a single touch, had never existed. She would run her fingers over the leather spines of the books he had given her, the memory of his words, "Beauty that survives is powerful," now a bitter, mocking taunt. The possibility that it had all been a game, a masterful and sadistic move to break not just her family's fortune, but her very spirit, began to take root in her heart, a cold, thorny vine of despair that threatened to choke the very life from her. But in the depths of that despair, confined to her room with only her guilt and her ghosts for company, a strange and unfamiliar feeling began to stir. It was a tiny, resilient spark of defiance. She replayed the moment in the antechamber, not with the filter of her mother's shame, but with the clarity of her own memory. The look in Damien's eyes when he saw her mark, the tremor in his voice when he spoke of wanting to put something beautiful back together, that had not been a lie. It was a truth as real and as profound as her own skin. She began to understand that her mother's rage was not born of her own failure, but her mother's fear. For the first time in her life, Alara had made a choice that was entirely her own, and the power of that, even with its devastating consequences, was a revelation. Unable to seek solace in her museum studio, she created a new sanctuary within her prison. From a dusty corner of the attic, she rescued a small, forgotten portrait of an anonymous woman, her features obscured by a century of grime and a fine web of craquelure. With trembling hands and a fierce newfound focus, she began the meticulous process of restoration. Each gentle cleaning with a cotton swab, each delicate application of pigment to a microscopic crack became a meditative act. She wasn't just mending the canvas, she was reassembling the shattered pieces of herself. In the quiet, focused work, she rediscovered her purpose, not as a daughter or a fiancée, but as a restorer, a woman whose unique gift was to find the enduring beauty in things that the world had deemed broken and worthless. Weeks later, the portrait was complete. The anonymous woman's eyes, now clear and luminous, stared back at Alara with an expression of quiet strength and profound resilience. She had survived. In that restored gaze, Alara saw her own reflection. Not the timid, broken girl, but a woman forged in the crucible of loss and betrayal. A decision crystallized in her heart, as clear and hard as a diamond. She would not wither in this silent house, waiting for a man who might never return. She would not accept the narrative of ruin her mother had written for her. For the first time, she would not react, she would act. She would leave this house, find Damien Blackwood, and demand the truth. Not as a supplicant begging for love, but as an equal demanding an answer.
a restorer ready to confront the beautiful, fractured man who had both ruined and saved her. She walked out of the grand, suffocating townhouse with nothing but a small satchel containing her restoration tools and the clothes on her back. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, a sound not of finality, but of liberation. The morning air of the city, once a foreign element she only observed through thick panes of glass, was now a bracing, vital shock to her system. It smelled of exhaust fumes, roasted nuts from a street vendor, and the faint, clean promise of rain. For the first time, the chaotic symphony of New York, the blare of horns, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of 1,000 conversations, did not feel like an assault. It felt like a welcome. She was no longer a ghost in her own life, a spectator behind a window.
She was a woman walking into the heart of the storm, her steps firm on the unforgiving pavement, her destination unknown, but her purpose absolute. Her instincts did not lead her to the gleaming, sterile fortress of Blackwood Tower, a monument to his power and isolation. Instead, they drew her back to the place where their story had begun, the silent, hallowed halls of the museum. Using her apprentice key, she let herself in long after the last patrons had departed, the galleries steeped in a reverent velvet darkness. The air was still and cool, thick with the scent of aged canvas and history. She moved through the familiar rooms, her soft footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The paintings on the walls were like old friends, their silent faces watching her progress. This was their ground, a space suspended between the broken past and the possibility of a mended future. It was here, surrounded by the beautiful, damaged things they both understood, that the truth would either be found or buried forever. She found him in a small, forgotten gallery dedicated to the Italian chiaroscuro masters, a room dominated by dramatic canvases of light wrestling with shadow. He stood before a painting of a martyred saint, his back to her, his powerful frame silhouetted against the single security light. He looked utterly alone, a man consumed by the darkness he so expertly navigated. He must have heard her approach, but he did not turn. She stopped a few feet behind him, the space between them charged with a year's worth of unspoken words. "I came for an answer," she said, her voice clear and steady, without a trace of the timid girl she had been. It was not a plea, it was a demand. He finally turned, and his face was a landscape of exhaustion and profound, weary pain. The vulture's mask was gone, leaving only the man, unguarded and exposed in the shadows. He did not offer excuses or justifications. His voice, when he spoke, was stripped of its usual authority, replaced by a raw, gravelly honesty that seemed torn from the deepest part of him. To see something pure, something so fiercely dedicated to mending what is broken, it was like holding a mirror up to a monster, he confessed, his gaze locked on hers. Everything I have ever built has been on a foundation of other people's ruin, my own ruin. I ran, Ilara, not from you, but from the person I saw myself becoming in your eyes. A man who might deserve to be mended. It was a hope I couldn't bear, a vulnerability I learned long ago would get me killed. His words were not a plea for forgiveness, but a stark, brutal confession, an unveiling of the scarred architecture of his soul, a place far more damaged than any canvas she had ever touched. She listened, her heart aching not with pity, but with a profound, soul-deep recognition. She saw the terrified boy he must have been, the boy who had armored himself in power to survive. Slowly, she closed the distance between them, the space that had once crackled with tension, now humming with a different kind of energy. She did not reach for his hand or his face. Instead, with a gesture of infinite tenderness and absolute certainty, She laid her palm flat against his chest, directly over his heart. She could feel its strong, frantic beat beneath her hand. "The first step of any restoration," she whispered, her eyes holding his, "is to accept the damage, not the end of it." She did not offer to save him. She offered him something far more real, the quiet, steady courage to face the ruins together, a silent promise that he was no longer alone in the dark. He covered her hand with his fingers lacing through hers, pressing her palm more firmly against him, as if she were an anchor in a raging sea. The future remained a vast, unwritten canvas, shadowed by the wreckage of her past and the formidable walls he had built around his heart. There were no easy promises, no simple resolutions. But here, in the profound silence of the gallery, surrounded by masterpieces that bore the scars of their own survival, they had found a place to begin. It was not a fairy tale ending, but the quiet, hopeful start of a difficult restoration, a shared commitment to mending two souls the world had tried to break. If you believe in the power of seeing the beauty in the damage, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, share this story with someone who needs it, and comment with your own story of survival.